Okay, so having said all of that, I think it sort of depends where you want to start. Given all of that, given that it's been used in different contexts, that it's becoming wider, for me it becomes quite difficult to say what's a transitional justice process and what's not a transitional justice process. And I think when we talk a little bit later about education, that's one of the challenges. What do we mean? Everything is arguably, if a society is emerging from conflict, everything can potentially become a transitional justice process if you take a very wide definition. In 2002, the Healing Through Remembering project, which I've worked with for many years in this society, carried out a consultation process. So you might want to think of that as the sort of pre-Eames-Bradley type of process. And at that time, we actually, I'm yet to find anybody who saw any of these, but we put adverts in 52 newspapers saying, write to us to tell us how you think the society should deal with the past. We got over 100 submissions, and we wrote this report. And what came out of that were these 14 ways that people spoke about dealing with the past. So now I've just used a slightly wider language than maybe transitional justice. Maybe they overlap. So storytelling and oral history, memorials, museums, exhibitions, public collective commemoration, days of remembrance, truth recovery, trials, community projects, victim support, research and social policy, compensation and reparation, centers for remembrance, self-examination and apologies, educational processes focusing on the past. And I actually think that's a really good list of what, to some degree, constitutes transitional justice or dealing with the past. And it's a list which came organically from a whole lot of organizations when we asked them one quite simple question. There have been some attempts to do this a little bit more systematically, and I find this quite helpful. It's developed by a group called Swiss Peace and the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs, who are very active in transitional justice issues globally. And they draw on a document called the Joined Principles, and they talk about transitional justice essentially having 4 pillars. So the right to know, the right to reparation, the right to justice, and guarantees of non-recurrence. We don't have time to go into all the other bits and pieces. They also put victim-perpetrator dynamics at the middle, talk about a reconciliation, and a whole range of other issues. But I really wanted to point to those 4 because I think those are quite good ways of maybe just trying to categorize where transitional justice might fit. So the right to know, truth commissions, investigations, archives, history books, exhumations, the right to reparation, rehabilitation, compensation, restitution, memorials, apologies, the right to justice, so various types of trial processes. And then they talk about non-recurrence, and what they mean by that, it might be demobilizing type of processes, institutional reform, lustration. I think it'd be interesting, and I haven't done that, to take this society and try and put a tick next to each of those boxes and see where we might be. But I think that their document's freely available. You can download it. It gives quite a nice framework. They don't actually, they talk about dealing with the past, so they use the slightly wider language. But I think what's interesting for your purposes here is that actually in each of those, when I was looking at it in preparation for this, you will see there's actually an educational component. So I'm moving into the education bit. So under the right to know, they talk about archives, history books, as part of the process of getting to know the truth about the past. They talk about educational material as one of the things which might come out of a reparation policy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then they talk about institutional reform under non-recurrence. So could that be the institutional reform of the education system as a whole, around a whole range of other types of systems? And then I put a sort of dotted line because I couldn't quite see it as clearly within the right to justice as I could see it in the other 3. But you could argue that justice processes might be about creating new forms of information and truth, which might inform how we understand the past. But I think it's quite an interesting little map, and for those of you who are interested, I think the exercise of maybe trying to say how we're doing on all of those might actually be quite an interesting exercise. So I'm going to jump just a little bit to the issue of education within some of this. And I think the problem is where do you start and where do you end? What do you talk about as being part of that wheel of transitional justice, or what do you talk about as processes of reform for a society that's trying to come to terms with human rights violations? And to be honest, I'm not really sure exactly where to draw those lines. And if you look at societies in transition, I just sort of made up a list here, you'll see various type of things that people will talk about, often not implement, but they'll talk about. So they'll talk a lot about curriculum development. So in South Africa, and I put set the past right in inverted commas, because in South Africa, big discussion, how do you write textbooks that, you know, tell the proper story of the past? And I always remember, as a South African growing up and being taught history, I had two seminal moments in my life. The one was my history teacher who said to me, now in the exam, this is what you need to write. Now I'm going to tell you what happened. And that was a massively important moment in my young 16-year-old brain, because he was saying, you know, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, this is what you had to write if you wanted to pass the exam. And I still want to go find this, but in our history textbook, there was a line about when South Africa was thrown out of the United Nations, the Commonwealth, I can't remember one of them, and the line in our history textbook was, and so South Africa left this body because no self-respecting nation could put up with that type of abuse. You know, which was like a complete sort of reversion of anything possible. But I remember that line, no self-respecting nation. So you'll hear people talking about curriculum development. Anyway, you guys know this better than me, setting the past right. You'll also hear, which maybe intersects a bit more with peace education, but curricula, which is about educating young people about prejudice, xenophobia, abuse of power, citizenship, human rights, that type of education. You'll also hear about work which is about bringing people together. So some of I presume what Maureen was talking about, bringing people together to share histories and share understandings, so inter-community dialogues. You will also find a lot of work around education and dialogues, and this is a growing focus around significant sites, museums and sites of atrocity. So there's some statistic I read at some point saying that in the last 10 years there have been more museums built than in the last 100 years. So basically this idea that we have to commemorate, and prisons and other things being turned into, it's not just a Northern Ireland problem, turned into education centres, shrines, museums, whatever language you want to use, is a global thing. Archives and research, it's a massive part of education. There's so much work going on around archives, whether it's the Stasi archive in East Germany, archives in Latin America, all over the world. Educational products, films, movies, and then artistic forms of expression. So if we look through that little wagon wheel I put up there, you'll see lots of different things. So I sort of made this up. And I don't know if it has any bearing on reality. But what I try to do is sort of say, well, then where would these fit within transitional justice? So the first thing I do is commit to a cardinal academic sin, which is to present something as linear, which isn't really linear, right? So we all know that if you think of this society, to say, well, when did the transition exactly begin, and when is it sort of after the transition, and on different issues, you might be going forward, and some issues you're going back. But for the purpose of simplicity, this is what I sort of made up. So taking that list, taking the wagon wheel, I sort of thought, well, if we were talking about education in some sort of transition, what might be the types of things you would see at different points in an ideal world where we're assuming we have a beginning of this transition, some sort of peace process, we then go through some transitional justice things, and then we sort of emerge on the other side. So we're assuming a scenario like that, which is obviously not always true. So before, what you might see is what you could call education for reconciliation. So education which is humanizing, bringing people together, learning about others, stuff which I think many of you have been engaged in this. You might see formal and informal processes of education. So informal, I mean movies, films, theatre that might be educating people about what happened. You might also see, maybe truth recovery is too strong, but you generally see in a lot of societies, even before they have any transitional justice or transition, people collecting narratives, collecting testimony. And in different countries, they use different words. here people like to use the word storytelling. In other parts of the world, they have no idea what you're talking about when you say storytelling. And in fact, if you move over the border, I think people have a different idea of what storytelling is. What goes on here, a lot of people might talk about more as narrative testimony or testimony taking. But all that's also different. Sometimes it's for legal purposes, sometimes it's to share. But in many societies, you would have that going on before the transition. So in South Africa, before the Truth Commission, we worked with a whole lot of NGOs to collect the statements that they had collected from people over 30 years and present that to the Truth Commission. So they've been doing that before the process. But I think education for reconciliation is probably the key for me there. Then if we assume that some sort of processes are going on, whether they're truth commissions, whether they're trials, whether they're historical investigation units as being proposed, or whether there's just a bit of memorialization, you might have a different role for education. There might be about information and education. So actually South Africa was quite good at that. So these processes with different groups from the police through to schools, telling people about this thing that was coming called the Truth Commission, trying to educate people about it. I was trying to find it last night, but we produced a comic book about the Truth Commission, which we distributed as educating about the process. So we're assuming something is actually happening. Outreach programs, again, our NGO, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, we ran about 300 workshops with people about what this process was. You might have a special focus on victims, again, documenting history and testimony. If we then assume miraculously this moves to some sort of after process, then we might then be talking more about changes in curriculum. That's a very common recommendation that's made in many of these societies. Doesn't always seem to follow itself through, but is a recommendation made. You might see a lot of education through museums, memorials, and archives, outreach work, which we now, say for example on World War II or whatever, we tend to take for granted. The Imperial War Museum North in Manchester does it all the time, educating people about that process as sort of after the fact. Access to education, educational reform, so the big sort of structural type of things. So many of these processes might come out with recommendations. Institutions should be reformed, or they contributed to division in society. So I sort of, as I say, I did sort of make that up, but those different types of things we spoke about, I would imagine there might be different roles. And I guess the challenge here is to say, where are we on that? And that there might be multiple mechanisms where there might be different needs for different things. So right now, there might be a need to talk about education and information about the Haas process, but it might be different if there was some sort of memorial process set up. I don't really know. The thing that I put at the bottom, because it's now just going to lead me on to my conclusion to talk a little bit about the challenges, is that I think underneath all of this is then a much bigger, let's call it existential question, which is then the problem with narratives and history. Because it's easy to say we're going to do all these things, we're going to have curriculum development, we're going to educate about this transitional justice process, but we're talking about divided societies. So people have divided ideas of this, they have different narratives. So that's going to then raise much bigger questions than simply saying we can do A or we can do B. To some degree, South Africa is a little bit easier because it's fairly clear what the dominant narrative is. So if you're saying reforming the education system, actually your problem is not trying to, is not so much about agreeing to reform it, it's maybe about it not going too far, that it creates a new sense of national identity that is a different agenda for a future government. So you're in a slightly sort of a different place.